Okay, so in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about replacing all taxation with a simple property tax based on the value of the property. The largest gain comes from the elimination of compliance costs. Right now, we have a lot of transactions taxes, taxes on income, uh, value added taxes, sales taxes, and these taxes require a tremendous amount of record keeping. The government has to know who everybody is. They have to know how much money you make so they can tax you properly. They have to know every transaction you make. It has to be recorded so that you can be taxed properly on it. And when you add up all these compliance costs, uh, I talked to a friend of mine, who's an economics professor at the University of Chicago. Actually, he's a finance professor. I said, I think it's probably something could be as high as 15% of GDP, real costs. So, and that would be 15% of the labor force is tied up in all these compliance costs, which it's all the enforcement, the record keeping, all the people have to go to school to learn all this, all the legal expenses, all the accounting expenses of all the corporations and everything else. And he had a word for it. I don't remember what it was. He says, I think you might be a little low. So I don't know. So what happens is if we eliminate all these transactions taxes and replace them with a simple real estate tax, which has almost no compliance costs. You don't even have to know who owns the house. If the house doesn't pay, the government puts it up for sale. Now, of course, you have to have the job guarantee that I talked about before, because you don't want people who lose their jobs being thrown out of their homes because they can't pay the property tax. And to avoid that, you have continuous full employment bolstered by the job guarantee and fiscal policy to make sure the people in the job guarantee are at a minimum. So we don't have that problem. Now, Europe was talking about a property tax, but they did it with high unemployment, which is just one of the cruelest things you can do. So I'm presuming full employment policy with this proposal. Okay, so let me get back to it. So what happens is you have an immediate potential gain of 15% of GDP, which means 15% of your real output can shift from producing compliance with tax codes and all that entails, all the legal and everything else, to something else. So let's say it shifts towards better public services. You use those same people, for every 100 people who are employed in the economy, 15 of those can now be directed towards public services, just for an example. Okay, so public services they disproportionately benefit the lower income people, because the very highest people, the very highest income, they're already paying for their own services. They're not going to, you're not going to be doing anything to improve their transportation. They're already flying around in private jets and that type of thing. But you are improving the education and the health and the transportation of the lower income people disproportionately. So let's say it's the lower 60% of the lower 60% of income earners that gain most of the benefit by the additional public services. You're now that 15% is now like a 25% increase for everyone. It's magnified because it all goes to the lower income earners. So you're improving the quality of life and standard of living of the average person by something like 25% simply by eliminating the compliance costs of these taxes we have and going to this property tax. So that was my first primary reason to do it, because of the real benefits to the economy of not having to have 15% of your population, of your working population, digging holes and filling them in, which is what compliance does when you don't need to have those taxes. It's a total waste of human endeavor. In addition, you eliminate a lot of the costs of being in business. Corporations the largest corporations spend tens of billions of dollars a year on these compliance costs. And by eliminating those, to the extent they're competitive, to the extent that they're trying for market share, you've lowered their costs. So it's a big deflationary force on the economy to have this happen. Second of all, you've stabilized your tax base. Right now, we have a tax base from transaction taxes, so it fluctuates wildly as the cycle goes up and down. As things get better, tax revenues come pouring in so fast they end the cycle. And the government's just not ever quick enough to catch it and prevent the next recession. With the stability of the property tax, you don't have that problem. You have a much more stable basis for the creating the sellers of goods and services, looking for your currency in return, and stabilizing the value of your currency, stabilizing the business cycles. I did make a list for these presentations, but let me just leave it on those two. I think I've used up my 5 minutes. And as you think more and more about the advantages of going to this tax, I think they're absolutely compelling. The biggest, yeah.
What could you think about housing guarantee program, for example, together with this proposal?
Well, you could do that, but don't forget, when you have the job guarantee, you're guaranteeing basic salary for anybody willing and able to work that will enable them to afford the rent, or as they move up in their jobs and in their salaries, afford to buy. Because you have the job guarantee wage is the minimum wage in the economy, and that can be set in real terms to make sure that the lowest income earners get their fair share of GDP. And so if you do have prices moving up, you can increase that to make sure that they get a real share all the time. And that, of course, being the de facto minimum wage, automatically increases wages for other wage earners that have the option of taking that job, of course, just through market forces. Additionally, you can introduce benefits through the job guarantee that become benefits for the whole economy, because business has to be competitive with this. So if everybody in the job guarantee is getting 2 weeks vacation, well, then the business has to give 2 weeks vacation. If everybody's getting a level of health care, then that has to be provided. Now, I think in Argentina, you have a universal health care that we don't in the US. But also you guarantee childcare, you guarantee other things to this group, then those benefits flow from the bottom up. Market forces will make sure that everybody gets those benefits. So it's a way to use market forces to your advantage to make sure that benefits flow from the bottom up and not from the top down, as they do in most places today.
And what is the time frame that you think we would need in order to introduce this tax reform? Do you think that this reform can be done immediately or over a certain period of time while you reduce the other taxes?
I think it can be done immediately. And I had an idea of phasing it in. And one way is to put this new property tax in place immediately, but have it be a deduction. Anything you pay is a deduction against your other taxes. And then you could phase it in after the first year. For the first year, they'd be parallel. You'd have high compliance costs, maybe the first 6 months. But then you could have the transition. This would go away. So that way you wouldn't interrupt the income stream, which is creating the sellers of goods and services looking for pesos, that you would have if you guessed wrong at the wrong level and you thought it was going to be a 10% property tax, and it turned out you needed 12 or something else. So by implementing it, making it a deduction against your other taxes paid, you have a little bit of a tax increase initially, but not a dramatic one, and then you can phase out those other taxes. The other thing it does is it dramatically reduces the problem of having non-residents, which you casually call foreigners, buying your real estate, because it becomes more expensive for them because they're suddenly have a 10% tax or whatever this number needs to be on real estate. It's not a burden for the people in the population because they were paying not much in taxes anyway through all the other taxes. But for people living abroad, it's not. It's a new tax. So now they're paying their pro rata share of the taxes that are supporting the entire public sector. And it's expensive, and it's harder for them to justify the investment, and it's probably going to go down a lot. And so they won't be in the markets out competing residents to the extent that they are now. I think it'd be a 90% reduction in the competition residents are getting from non-residents to live in their cities, live in the country.